waving my hand. And I'm going to share my screen.
Wonderful.
And everybody is going to mute themselves, right? Is that
Yes,
right?
please. Thank you, Betsy. Please, please, please do mute yourselves. Everybody will enjoy it a lot more if we do. Okay. I'm just going to move this little guy out of the way because this gets in my way. All right. If you can't see this, do unmute yourselves, but hopefully you'll be able to see this. Okay, so thanks for coming to the next talk in this series. So as a tie-in to the coronation of King Charles III, which happened about 10 days ago, I wanted to spend some time today talking about the lives and reigns of his royal predecessors who shared his name. So two Stuart kings here, Charles I, who was the only reigning English monarch to be tried and executed for treason, and his son, Charles II, on the right here, who reigned over some of London's most significant events, including the Great Fire of 1666, which we will touch on briefly. Now, the interesting thing about these two, they both faced very similar problems during their reigns. They had political problems. There was a lot of religious strife, which is a running theme through British history once we get to Henry VIII and go on from there. And their relationship, they also, both of them had a kind of prickly and problematic relationships with Parliament. But the way they handled their situations and the outcomes for each of them were vastly different. And we're going to look at that a little bit. All right. So before I can talk about Charles, I really do have to mention how the Stuart dynasty began in England. And it namely began with this man, James VI of Scotland and first of England. He was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII, and he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary abdicated her throne and went into exile in England shortly after James's birth. So James was just a baby when he became the king of Scotland. And he was almost 21 years old when his mother was executed by Elizabeth I on charges of treason. I'm not going to get into that here, but so he was never really brought up with his mother. He didn't really have a strong connection with his mother. But because he was connected to the British royal family, because he was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, he was the likely successor, or one of the likely successors to the throne upon the death of Elizabeth I. And indeed, in March of 1603, Elizabeth I died. She was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. She did not have children. And throughout her reign, she was very hesitant to name a successor. It was dangerous back then to name your successors because they might try to kill you and get you out of the way. So even in the last few weeks of her life, she really did not want to name anybody. But while she was on her deathbed, a minister did kind of press her and say, you know, Your Majesty, it's going to be James. It's going to be James, right? And they said she drew a little circle over her head with her finger. And they took that to indicate that she was gesturing a crown, meaning, yes, she was saying it was going to be James. So James became king. He was an interesting guy in and of himself. We get the King James Bible from him. He was really into witch hunting. He was really into the evils of tobacco. He was ahead of himself that way. He wrote a whole treatise on how bad tobacco was for people. But he also believed in the absolute right of kings. And to this end, he really thought that, you know, kings were chosen by God. They were answerable to nobody but God. And to this end, he really did try to limit the power of Parliament when he was king. This was an approach that was adopted by his son, Charles I, to pretty disastrous results, as we're going to see in a minute. So that's all I wanted to say about James for right now. And that brings us to his son. So when James died in 1625, his eldest son, his eldest surviving son, was this guy, 25-year-old Charles, and he succeeded him to the throne. Now, Charles was born in 1600. And actually, he was never meant to be king. If you came to one of the earlier talks, I think I mentioned this with Henry VIII. You know, Henry VIII had an older brother who died. Same way with Charles. Charles had this older brother who he adored, Henry, Prince of Wales, who was several years older than him. So Henry should have become king. Henry was said to be handsome and intelligent and athletic and very, very popular. But he died at the age of 18, probably from typhoid fever. And he died just a couple of weeks before Charles turned 12 years old. Charles could not have been more different than his brother Henry. And again, in retrospect, you know, someone who dies, especially young, is always glorified. So who knows what Henry really would have been like as king. But Charles was a totally different beast, at least when he came to the throne. He was very small of stature. He was only about 5'3" as an adult. And he suffered from ill health and physical infirmities, particularly when he was a child. He had a pronounced stutter, and he needed braces to strengthen his legs. So this guy, and he was not charismatic. He was not charming. He was very aloof. So very, very different from his brother. But of course, as the heir to his father, it was imperative that he make a really good marriage, as all royals had to do. And initially he was going to marry, he was pursuing a match with a Spanish princess. That kind of fell through. And then he ended up making an alliance with this young woman, Henrietta Maria. She was the youngest daughter of the late King Henry IV of France, and his wife, Marie de Medici, from the very powerful and well-known Medici family, the Italian family. So again, this was obviously a diplomatic match. By now, Henrietta Maria's brother is on the throne. He's Louis XIII of France. And basically, they set this up because they wanted to create an alliance between Britain and France. Henrietta's brother was kind of fighting with the Habsburgs in Spain. And you always had this triangulation going on between England, Spain, and France. They were all like taking sides against each other and ganging up on each other and making alliances. So in this case, England and France decided to make this alliance through this marriage to fight the Spanish, to fight the Habsburgs in Spain. So the marriage got off to a very bumpy start, unfortunately. Henrietta Maria was only 15 when she married Charles. She was 9 years younger than him. Her reputation was that of being feckless and shallow, self-indulgent. It said that she spent a lot of money, a great deal of money on clothing and jewels. And she also didn't get along with Charles's favorite. He had a guy who he was very fond of in his government, the Duke of Buckingham, first Duke of Buckingham, named George Villiers. And this caused a lot of problems early in their marriage because Henrietta Maria and George just did not get along. And also from the start, you know, right from the start, Charles's marriage was not popular with the people, certainly not popular with the government, because Henrietta Maria was French. Even though they were making this alliance with French, they were always fighting the French. But also she was a Catholic, and that was a big, big problem for them. There was a fear that this was going to lead to a Catholic succession. And again, if you know anything about Henry VIII, and I talked about this earlier, Henry VIII broke with the Church of Rome when he wanted to marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn, and divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And from that day forward, there were always problems in England between the Catholics and the Protestants and who was ruling. So this was not a popular match for a lot of people. And even though Charles said to Parliament, he said, look, there were already religious restrictions on Catholics at this time. And Charles said, look, I'm not going to lift any of these. I'm not going to change any of these restrictions on Catholics. Don't worry, Parliament. You know, I'm not going rogue on you and turning into a Catholic. At the same time, he was playing it both ways because he did make a promise to his Catholic brother-in-law, Louis XIII of France, that the restrictions would be loosened on the Catholics. And indeed, they were. And in fact, Henrietta Maria was a very strict Catholic. She was not about to change her religion. She was given her own chapel. This is the Queen's Chapel. It's attached to, well, it's across the road from now, but it was attached to St. James's Palace in London, all of this area was St. James's Palace at the time. Originally, it was being built for that Spanish princess who was also Catholic that Charles was pursuing, but instead it went to Henrietta Maria. And Henrietta Maria also had a very lavish chapel in Somerset House, which was one of her private homes in London, given to her as queen, and people would come and worship with her there. So a little bit of problem there for some people. And in fact, during Charles I's coronation in February of 1626, Henrietta Maria would not take part. She did not take part in that because she disapproved of the Protestant ceremony. So there was always this tension in terms of religion. But over time, Henrietta Maria and Charles did come to love one another. And while their first child, they had a son, and unfortunately that child died shortly after birth, she had 8 more children, 2 of whom would become kings. And as we'll see a little bit later, she was also a very strong supporter of her husband during the English Civil Wars. So they ended up actually having a good marriage, a happy marriage, despite their kind of bumpy start. And just as a bit of trivia for you, the US state of Maryland is named for Henrietta Maria. King Charles I presented a charter to the colony back in 1634, and it actually became a refuge for Roman Catholics. I don't know if that was intentional or not, given Henrietta Maria's religion, but anyway, it was named for Henrietta Maria. So as I said, Henrietta Maria and Charles did end up having a happy marriage. They did have several children. And this is a very famous painting by Van Dyck. And you can see here on the left, from left to right, their daughter Mary, who ended up marrying a Dutch prince. Next to her is James, the future James II, who we will get into next month, if you come to that talk. Next to him is Charles, the future Charles I, with that massive dog next to him. And then 2 more daughters, Elizabeth, who unfortunately died at the age of 15, and baby Anne, who only lived 3 years. So Henrietta Maria did end up, even later in life, ended up outliving many of her children. Okay, so despite this happy home life, all was not well with King Charles's reign. He faced a lot of issues, religious issues, social issues, economic issues, political storms. And over time, he really did become increasingly unpopular for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was this divine right of kings idea here. This was a political doctrine, and it was very popular in France. And it really what it did was it defended absolutism for the monarchy. So, like I said, it asserted that kings derived their authority from God, and therefore they could not be held accountable for their actions by any earthly authority, such as Parliament. So that caused real big problems, as we will see. And in fact, all of these things, the Duke of Buckingham, who I mentioned before, the religious conflict going on, all of this caused bad relationships with Parliament. So let's start with the Duke of Buckingham, who I mentioned a minute ago. Here you can see him. He's quite the dandy. Charles I had an almost blind devotion to this guy. He was a leading government minister, both under Charles's father, James, and then under Charles himself. And he had a very large influence over both of these men. He was said to be very handsome and ambitious and extravagant and vain. So he was not, surprisingly, he was not very popular among other members of the court. They accused him of being corrupt, which he probably was. And on top of everything else, he made really poor, he was given a lot of power, but he made really poor political and military decisions. In fact, more than once, Parliament called for the king to put him aside, especially after he made a couple of really bad political blunders in different conflicts and wars. And they went so far, Parliament went so far as to actually present a bill of impeachment against Buckingham. But Charles, being Charles and honing on to his deep loyalty to this guy, but also believing in the divine right of kings, he said, Parliament can't tell me what to do. So he ended up dissolving Parliament. He closed down Parliament. Now, Buckingham's influence over Charles I ended when he was assassinated in 1628. There was a disgruntled naval officer who had been discharged from the Navy, and this guy, Buckingham, had been kind of in charge of the Navy for a while, and this disgruntled officer approached him and killed him. So that was the end of Buckingham, and that's probably when Charles and Henrietta Maria started getting along better as well, possibly. But that dissolving of Parliament over that issue just went to show this history that Charles was going to have with Parliament, this very bad history. So Charles dissolved Parliament 3 times between 1625 and 1629. And then from 1629, from about March of 1629 until April of 1640, he ruled without consulting Parliament. This is what was called his personal rule. So he enacted policies, he levied taxes and to raise money, all of this without getting the consent of his government. And in fact, there was one very controversial example of this, where there was something called ship money. And this was, what Charles did was he revamped this old law. So there was this old law going, I believe, back to the medieval period, where coastal counties in England provided ships to the crown. They gave ships to the crown. Well, Charles revamped this, again, without consulting Parliament. He turned this into a money tax, a straight money handover, and he levied it on all the counties in England, not just those that were inland. So that made him very unpopular. Now, if you look sort of outwardly just at what was going on at this time, it was a period of peace. There were no wars going on at this particular moment in time. There was prosperity for a lot of people. But Charles was slowly building up opposition against him, not just because of these financial policies and these taxes, but also, as I mentioned before, the religious piece of this, which we're going to talk about now. So Charles home, he was an Anglican, but Church of England, but he subscribed to this very what they call high Anglicanism type of Anglicanism, which is almost close to Catholicism. At least some people saw it that way. And he was, again, very set in his ways. So along with his Archbishop of Canterbury, a guy named William Laud, he introduced a series of very unpopular religious reforms. And he really got in trouble when he tried to force the Church of England to adopt high Anglican practices, including a new version of the Book of Common Prayer. You don't mess with the Scots and their religion. They were very independently focused. The king was not the head of their church as far as they were concerned. So of course they were not very happy about this at all. This led to a very expensive war with Scottish Presbyterians. And in April of 1640, Charles was not winning the war, and he had to summon Parliament back after he dissolved them, summon them back because he needed their money. He needed money to raise funds for the war. But Parliament said, listen, we're not even going to talk to you about this until you address our other grievances. The fact that you're going rogue on us, the fact that you're creating these policies and levying taxes without talking to us, we don't want to have anything to do with you until these issues are resolved. So what did Charles do? He dissolved Parliament again, less than a month later. So again, this is really a precursor for what's coming in terms of Charles not being able to work with Parliament. So of course the Scottish were victorious. Charles didn't have the money to fight them. A fragile truce was called, but war broke out again not too long after that. And once again, the Scots were victorious. They defeated the English army. They actually came down and invaded England. And once again, Charles had to, attempt to make a peace with them. So in October 1640, he had to make this peace with them. But as part of that, he had to agree to pay the Scottish military who had invaded England £850 a day just to get them to leave until they left. So at that point, there was no way he could avoid asking Parliament for money. So in November of 1640, once again, he brings Parliament back because he needs money from them. And only a year later, there was an uprising in Ireland, another religious uprising. This was between Catholics in Ireland and Scottish Presbyterians who had settled in Ireland. Lots of bad blood resulted in the massacre of Protestants at a place called Portadown. And this violence, of course, just fueled further anti-Catholic sentiment and reinforced members of Parliament who were Puritans, who were really anti-Catholic. And they were saying, you know something, we don't like the fact that this guy, that Charles married a Catholic. We don't like the fact that he made concessions to Catholics when he said he wasn't going to. We don't like the fact that he's not consulting us. We think he's a closet Catholic. A lot of people thought he was a closet Catholic. And this just drove them further to wanting to get rid of Charles. And indeed, with tensions on all sides kind of escalating enormously, in August of 1642, Charles attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament. Not a good move. So suddenly you go from Charles and Parliament who are having trouble working together, they can't communicate, to suddenly you've got this whole breakdown, this huge breakdown going on in the government, and it resulted in a civil war. So the Parliament is raising their own forces, and Charles has his forces, and you've got communities across the country divided. And Charles actually formally declared war on the forces of Parliament in August of 1642. So you had 2 sets here. You had the royalists, who are called the Cavaliers, and they were loyal to the crown, obviously. And then you have the parliamentarians called the Roundheads, and they were loyal, they were anti-monarchy, if you will, in that case. They were anti-Charles in any event. The parliamentary army was led by the future Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. We'll talk about him more a little later. But he established a full-time and professional fighting army, which England didn't really have before. You'd go out to your barons and your nobles and you'd say, bring your men, arm your men, you've got people, bring them. But now Oliver Cromwell actually created a full-time professional army where they're getting paid, by the government. And this was known as the New Model Army. So there were a series of battles. There were actually 3 kind of little civil wars, all told, in almost 20 years. And one of the most decisive battles was the Battle of Naseby in June of 1645. And during that time, the royalist forces were really crushed. Their resources were scarce. Charles was running out of money, running out of time. In May of 1646, Charles was captured, and he was handed over to the English parliamentary forces. And there were still people in Parliament at that time who were trying to work with Charles. And they were saying, okay, we demand a constitutional monarchy. We're not saying get rid of you, but we want a constitutional monarchy. Well, we're the ones making the laws. We're the ones running the show, more or less. And of course, Charles being Charles said, no, not going to do this. He was under house arrest for a while. He escaped for a brief time, but was recaptured. And of course, as you can see from this slide, it doesn't end well for Charles, if you didn't already know this story. So we get to 1648. Oliver Cromwell's army has really firm control over England at this point. And by the beginning of the following year, 1649, any moderate MPs who had been in Parliament, who had said, okay, let's negotiate with the king, they were gone. They'd been expelled. So you had something called a rump parliament. And these were the guys who were really the Puritans, who were really, forget it. We're not going to try to compromise with this guy anymore. They had supreme power. So in January of 1649, Charles was put on trial in Westminster Hall. He was accused of treason against England for using his power as king to follow his own personal interests instead of the interests of the country. And he was sentenced to death. And this all happened quite rapidly because only 3 days after his sentencing, he was beheaded outside of Banqueting House. Banqueting House was part of Whitehall Palace, which was a very large Tudor Stuart palace, one of the main palaces in London at that time. And they actually had him, you can kind of see, well, you can't really, you sort of see from this image. What they did was, if you go to Banqueting House today, it's the only part of Westminster Palace that still exists, and you can go tour it. inside on what we call the second floor, what the British call the first floor is the ground floor in Britain, but up on the second story, they had the windows opened up and they built a platform out there. So he was actually above the ground when they executed him. This was absolutely unheard of. And this was met, with horror by monarchs and rulers in Europe, because this was before the French Revolution. This was absolutely unheard of, that you would try a king. Obviously, kings got bumped off all the time in other ways, but kind of behind the scenes. There was not a British king who was tried for treason and then executed. And unfortunately for Charles, he had these unwavering strong principles. He was very inflexible. And his belief in the divine right of kings, all of those factors, and the fact that he was very aloof and he didn't connect with people, all of these factors really led to his demise, very sadly so. His wife, I mentioned Henrietta Maria before, she and the children all went into exile in Europe when the wars were going on, except Charles, the future Charles II. We'll see that he stayed behind and helped his father. But, the younger children went with Henrietta Maria, but she was over in Europe raising money for him, raising armies for him. But she also wrote to him frequently and said, look, you've got to compromise, you've got to compromise. And he just wouldn't do it. He refused to do it. So that was the end of Charles. But shortly after his death, this book came out, translated into English, its Portrait of the King. It was published right after his death. And basically it talks about the civil wars, it talks about Charles's early imprisonment, and it defends his policies. And it really is, if you look at it, it's a combination of a political memoir and almost a spiritual autobiography. And it kind of presents Charles as both a defender of the church and the state. And it was thought to have been written by Charles himself. That's why I say memoir and autobiography, in collaboration with the Bishop of Worcester, a guy named John Gowden. And in fact, the first edition of this was in print the day of Charles's execution. So Charles may have been in contact with Gowden and talking to Gowden during these times, and then Gowden probably ended up really publishing the book and writing the book himself, because it was first in print on the day of his execution, and it became an immediate bestseller. Everybody was flocking to get it. And in fact, in the year of Charles's death alone, 35 editions were published in England, and a further 25 were published elsewhere in Europe. So this became a really hot item. And it portrays Charles as a moderate, peace-loving ruler. And so this kind of changed the narrative about Charles I with some people. Some people started seeing his execution as an act of martyrdom. And you can see on the left here that this was one of the front piece of one of the editions. It presents Charles as kind of a saint and a martyr. So if you look closely, he is grasping in his hand a crown of thorns, like Christ's crown of thorns. And at his foot here, down here, at his feet, is his royal crown. He's cast that aside. He's holding on to the heavenly crown of thorns, and he's gazing upward into the heavens, being a martyr. So that was an interesting take. And there are still people today, as with Richard III, as we've talked about before, there are still people today who are pro-Charles and anti-Charles, not quite as much as the kind of feelings that go along with Richard III, but still there are people who say that he was sacrificed. There are other people who say he was a murderer. The English Civil Wars had a huge amount of death. I think close to, if I'm trying to remember, I think close to 200,000 people died. So, some people said, no, he was a murderer. If he had not been like this, those wars never would have happened. He's got blood on his hands. But as I said, he does still have his supporters. And every year on the last Sunday in January, there is an annual march from St. James's Palace to Banqueting House in London. And it's carried out by the King's Army of the English Civil War Society, and it's to commemorate Charles's execution. And the procession follows his last route. So he was being held at St. James's Palace, which is, if you've been to London, just a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace. And he walked from St. James's Palace across the parks over to Banqueting House. So that's what these guys do. And they're all dressed, as you can see. This is a reenactment, and their clothes exactly as soldiers would have looked in 1649. They have a short ceremony. And they have a wreath of remembrance that they lay at banqueting house at the end of the ceremony to commemorate Charles and his death. So what did Charles leave us? Well, his legacy, of course, was the English Civil Wars, but he did have another legacy that is still visible today, and that is he was a passionate collector of art and had a really good eye for art and a very passionate collector of art. And many of his pieces are still in the royal collection today. This is a very interesting painting by Van Dyck again, 3 images of Charles I. And actually, I just discovered I'm doing a talk for Lifelong on Charles III and discovered a painting that is in this style of Charles III, interestingly enough, with these 3 images. Anyway, during his reign, Charles assembled one of his great collection of 15th to 17th century art. As said, the guy had a really good eye. He bought paintings from by Da Vinci, Raphael, Titian. He was Britain's first collector of Rembrandt, and he used Van Dyck a lot. He sponsored Van Dyck. He was his principal painter, but also Spanish painters, Italian painters made his portraits. And by the time he died in 1649, he had a collection of about 1,500 paintings and 500 sculptures. So he had a huge collection. Now, after he died, his collection was sold off and dispersed across Europe. But during the Restoration, when his son Charles II came to the throne, many of those works were retrieved and found and brought back to England. But there are still lots of other pieces that are scattered around Europe today, some in really big museums like the Louvre, the Prado, but others in smaller collections as well. So I would say if we're looking at legacy, aside from that very unfortunate English Civil War, Charles I did give the country quite an art collection. All right, so then we moved into about a 12-year period, the interregnum period, where the monarchy was replaced by a commonwealth headed by Oliver Cromwell on the left here. I mentioned him earlier. Very controversial man in and of himself. Of course, he was hated by the royalists for his role in the trial and execution of Charles, but also he became increasingly unpopular with many members of parliament as well, because interestingly enough, although Oliver Cromwell was a Republican, kind of anti-monarchist, if you will, he really kind of became a de facto king himself. He was given the title Lord Protector for life, for his lifetime. He moved into the royal palaces. He himself dissolved parliament. And in fact, he was succeeded by his son when he died. So just like a king would be, basically. It was said he even sat on a throne when he met with the government officials. He sat on one of the royal thrones. He was also unpopular because as a Puritan, he banned leisure activities like theaters and gambling and taverns. And he also conducted really bloody campaigns in Scotland and in Ireland, particularly in Ireland, where he suppressed the Catholic faith, seized vast amounts of land. His name is still mud in many parts of Ireland today. Well, he died in 1658. He was succeeded by his son Richard, but his son was very ineffectual. He didn't possess any of his father's military or political skills. He also fought with Parliament, but he had nothing going for him. He was fighting with the army and with Parliament. And that's what started to trigger this final downfall of the interregnum period and the restoration of the monarchy. And just down the right here, there's another, I think this is very interesting. So there's a statue of Cromwell outside of Parliament, and he's looking kind of over toward St. Margaret's Church. And there's a bust on the outside of the wall of St. Margaret's Church of Charles I. So they say that they're kind of looking at each other from across the street. All right, so this takes us to Charles II. Now, before we talk about the Restoration, I just want to talk a little bit about his early life. Again, very different from his father in every sense of the word. He was 6'2". His father was 5'3". Big differential there. But in many other senses of the word. So Charles spent his very early childhood at Richmond Palace, surrounded by his siblings, but his childhood was cut short at the age of 8 when these civil wars began to take hold. And when Henrietta Maria left for Europe, she left in 1642, the 12-year-old Charles, future Charles II, he stayed with his father. He went on military campaigns with his father. And when he was only 15, he was actually given command of the Royalist army in Western England. Now, by this time, London was lost. London was lost to the parliamentarians. So Charles I had set up kind of a shadow court in Oxford, and that's where he was with his son, the future Charles II. And then he gave him command. He said, okay, you're going to go to the West Country counties. You're going to, be in command of the armies there. So Charles II, future Charles II, left Oxford, went to Bristol and later Cornwall, and he never did see his father again. So that's the last time he saw his father. But as we saw from that earlier slide, things did not go well with these civil wars. And in March of 1646, the parliamentary army was on the rise. The then Prince Charles, he left Cornwall for the Scilly Islands, which are right off of Cornwall. Later went to Jersey, another set of islands off of England. And then finally did join his mother, went into exile and joined his mother at the court of Louis XIV in France. And then later on, he went to the Netherlands where his sister was. She was married to William of Orange. So he went to The Hague. And this is where he learned that his father had been convicted and executed of high treason. Now, Charles I, as we saw, did not get along well with the Scots, but when news of his death reached Edinburgh, the Scottish Parliament instantly proclaimed his son king, because they didn't like Cromwell at all anyway. So they said, okay, we are instantly saying as our parliament that our king is Charles II. And then Charles, acting on this, he sailed to Scotland in June of 1650, and he became the last monarch to be crowned in that country. So he had a coronation ceremony at Scone Palace on the 1st of January, 1651. And then, as we'll see later, he had a second ceremony in London. He tried to invade England with Scottish forces, but his army was defeated by Oliver Cromwell. And as he fled away from all of this, he fled away to try to get away the day after one really disastrous battle. And there's this famous story that he hid in an oak tree while the forces were looking for him. He and a couple of companions supposedly hung out in this oak tree, this local oak tree, for the day. And in fact, there's something called Oak Apple Day, or there used to be called something called Oak Apple Day. It became a national day of Thanksgiving in England. And it was a national day of Thanksgiving in England until 1859. And today, if you go to England, the Royal Oak remains one of the most popular English pub names. And this is based on the fact that the future Charles II supposedly fled from this battle that they lost and hid in an oak tree for the day. And this is not the original oak tree. Those are long gone, but it was said that he and his companions sat up there, they drank beer, they ate cheese, they watched these guys running around trying to find them. It's long gone, but this is an 18th century descendant of that tree called the son of the Royal Oak. Still stands on the site today. You can see the little fence around it. So you can go see this oak tree if you like. And there were commemorations too. They put out commemorative, so this is a plate. This was done later, obviously. This is done in 1680, but the Royal Oak, and you can see the crowns hanging off there. I'm not sure why there are 3. And you can see Charles's face kind of hiding in the oak tree there. So what led to Charles II, the restoration of the monarchy, and Charles II coming back? Well, we already know that, Oliver Cromwell's son was not very popular with people. There were a lot of tensions. People were war weary. This war went on for almost 20 years. So people were tired. There were economic issues. Taxes had been raised. There was declining trade. There was property that was seized during the wars, and how that property was distributed became problematic. The army hadn't been paid, so there were payment due to soldiers, and the Rump Parliament was fighting with the army all of a sudden. So the Parliament was not getting along with the army. because there was this balance of power problem going on. So this all caused a lot of chaos. It caused a lot of dissent. And in early 1660, like I said, you've got this rump parliament. They're nominally in power, but they are really pretty much just made up of the people who oversaw the execution of Charles I. So many constituencies felt that they didn't have any members of parliament to speak for them. And they thought that parliament was very unrepresentative of the country as a whole. So people in those constituencies started sending these petitions of grievance, they were called, and they sent some to parliament and they sent some to the army. And the ones that went to the army, a lot of them went to this guy on the right, General George Monk, a very powerful general. So here you've got Britain sliding into disarray, and you start seeing citizens and even politicians saying, you know something, maybe we should go back to the monarchy. maybe we didn't appreciate what we had. It was at least stable. And we don't want to mess with this anymore. So Monk got a lot of these petitions. Initially, he really was not in favor of restoring the monarchy, but he kind of came around and he went to parliament and he said, okay, we're going to elect a whole new parliament. The army is demanding a whole new parliament. And indeed, they did set up a new parliament with a lot of royal supporters. And then Monk started kind of secret, quiet negotiations with Charles II over in France, over in Europe, to say, actually, I think he was still in the Netherlands, let's talk about you coming back. Let's talk about what this might look like to bring the monarchy back. So in April of 1660, Charles II issued something called the Declaration of Breda. And it promised, he was very smart in this way. Again, not like his father. He was much more flexible, much more politically savvy. So he wrote this declaration and he said, look, I'm going to promise a general pardon for actions committed during the civil wars and during the interregnum period. And that was called the Act of Oblivion and Indemnity. And he said, I'm going to pardon everybody. If I come back, no one's going to be blamed for this, or except those who killed my father, who put my father on trial and killed him, the regicides. And he said, retention of property, anyone who got property during the war, who bought it, who seized it, you can keep it as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to try to take that property away. He also, in this declaration, said that I'm going to make sure that people can worship as they please, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, whatever you are. So this is a liberty for you to, follow your own conscience in terms of religion. Unless, he said, it threatens national peace. And he said, I will make back payments to the new model army. And he also wrote a letter to the Speaker of the House of Commons. And he said, listen, the liberties and powers of both the king and parliament are best preserved by preserving the other. So he was saying, I'm going to work with you. I'm going to do everything I can to work with you. So Parliament said, okay, sounds like a good deal. Let's proclaim Charles king. Let's invite him to return to England. He came back on May 29th, which was his 30th birthday. He entered London in triumph. The streets were full. It was a bloodless restoration, basically. They didn't have to have another war over this. No foreign powers really got involved. And most interestingly enough, there were still people in Parliament, even though they were now royalists in Parliament, there were still people, even Monk, who was against, the restoration initially, who were the king's potential enemies, but now welcoming him back. So this was very, very interesting. Now, if you took if you came to the talk that I gave on royal coronations, this part's going to be a little familiar to you. Charles was very aware of the power of display and symbolism. So he put on the most extravagant coronation since that of Elizabeth I in 1559. Again, he took on many of the medieval practices. He had the last grand procession from the Tower of London. Monarchs used to spend a few nights before their coronation at the Tower of London and then process through the city of London down to Westminster. He had the last procession from the Tower of London. He had a big, magnificent banquet after the coronation. And he, I think, probably intentionally, chose April 23rd, which was St. George's Day, patron saint of England, for the date of his coronation. Now, again, if you came to the coronations talk, you'll remember perhaps that the medieval regalia, the symbols of sovereignty and monarchy, the crowns, the orbs, the scepters, those were all melted down in the interregnum period. Oliver Cromwell destroyed all of those or sold them. It didn't sell them off, actually melted them down, used them for coinage in some cases. So all new regalia had to be made. The only thing that survived from the original medieval regalia was the coronation spoon, which is not in this picture here. But on the right, you can see all of the new regalia that was created just for Charles II. And you can see Charles II on the left here in his coronation robes with all his regalia. And he really did, he wanted to present himself as the opposite of his father's kind of cold, formal distance. Now, in fairness to Charles I, his coronation happened during a plague. So he could not have a grand procession and all of this because just like with COVID, people were kept off the streets. Charles II had a big splashy coronation, but he did want to make himself more accessible. So his subjects could actually come watch the king swimming, playing tennis, sailing on the Thames. And during this time in his early reign, all these books and pamphlets and things were coming out that presented Charles, as this youthful, good-looking, virile king. So he had his PR machine going for him. But as I said at the start of the talk, he also had challenges not dissimilar to his father's. He did try from the start to really fulfill his declaration, the Breda Declaration. And he wisely chose advisors from men who had served on different sides of the conflict of the English Civil Wars. So he was trying to, be bipartisan, if you will. He gave Parliament the power to legislate pardons, to legislate on ownership of property that was seized during the English Civil Wars, and to legislate on religious settlements. And he did this, I think, for two reasons. First of all, he did want to prove to Parliament, I am ruling by consent, okay? Maybe not quite a constitutional monarchy at this point yet, but nonetheless, you guys are, I'm going to hand over this legislation to you. I want to prove that I want to work with you. But Charles II was a very, as I said, wily, politically savvy character. So he also knew that these issues, the land that was seized, the religious issues, the pardons, he also knew that these issues were somewhat controversial. So by giving them to Parliament to decide, then it takes all the pressure off him, right? He can't be blamed. He can't be blamed. So he was kind of smart that way. But he did indeed, the new model army was paid off and it was peacefully disbanded. Parliament initially did not want to go along with that act of oblivion and indemnity. He had to really work hard with them to convince them to do that, but they did. They finally did go along with that. But nonetheless, when he came to the throne, the country had been through 3 civil wars in 20 years. Over 200,000 people had died. He was really ruling a people traumatized by all of this, and that's not a straightforward task. War was going on with the Dutch. There were financial issues. He came back broke. There were financial shortcomings. There were still religious issues going on because there were always religious issues going on. And again, all of these did cause some problems with Parliament, although Charles II was better at working with Parliament than his father was. So he was very skillful at I got one slide ahead of me there. He was very skillful at negotiating and making compromises. He knew, because he didn't have money, he knew that he had to work with Parliament on a peacetime budget. He had to go to Parliament for money. So he had to go along with their wishes. And what that meant was he wasn't quite as principled as his father was in this sense. So he compromised on his ideals in more than one case. So, he said, okay, I'm going to give religious tolerance to everybody, an accommodation. But those plans were rejected by Parliament. And in fact, in 1662, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity, and it meant that you had to use the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. That was compulsory. You had to use that. And the act, because of this, drove many Presbyterian ministers and their followers out of the Church of England. And after that, they came up with another piece of legislation that said you cannot have religious meetings outside the physical church. So that meant that, Charles's promises of you can follow your own conscience, you can do whatever you want, those went by the wayside. So Charles was making compromises to keep himself safe and to, stay on the good side of Parliament. But later in his reign, he did push back on Parliament on a religious issue. So in 1678, there was this phony conspiracy theory, and I'm going to talk more about this next month and then in the next talk. But there was this phony conspiracy theory called the Popish Plot, and it was said that the Catholics were plotting to assassinate Charles II and put his younger brother James on the throne. James at that time was Duke of York, and he was a Catholic. He had converted to Catholicism. Well, this was disproven. There was never any conspiracy about this. But Parliament kind of grabbed onto this, and this created something called the exclusion crisis. So Parliament said, okay, because James II is Catholic, or not James II, he wasn't James II yet, because the Duke of York is Catholic, James is Catholic, because Charles II had no, they were worried because he had no heirs. He did not have any heirs with his wife. So they said, okay, James cannot be king. He's got to be taken out of the royal line of succession. Well, this was a step too far for Charles II. He said, no, I'm not going to compromise on the hereditary succession. And the way he got around that was he did something his father had done before him. He dissolved Parliament. He dissolved Parliament in March of 1681, and he never called it again for the last 4 remaining years of his life. But nonetheless, he lived to tell the tale. It was not that big a deal. He managed to survive. Okay, now that's where I wanted to be. So I mentioned in the Declaration of Breda that Charles had promised a general pardon for acts committed during the Civil War, but anyone involved in the trial and execution of his father, Charles I, were not included in that pardon. Now, some of the people responsible for the trial and execution of Charles I had already died or escaped to the continent, and some even went to the US. There's a really good book, novel about it that I read not too long ago called Act of Oblivion by Richard Harris. Really good book about 2 of these guys who escaped to the US and people trying to hunt them down. Anyway, so some of them were already dead, some of them had already escaped, but others were rounded up and executed by Charles II, and they had a gruesome death. They had what they called, most of them died by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This is not an image from that. This is actually from a German print. But basically you were hung up, and while you were still alive, you were cut down, you were disemboweled while you were still alive. It was terrible, really awful. But that's how they dealt with treason at that time. And in fact, Charles II went one step further. Even those who had died, their bodies were dug up and they were subjected to a posthumous execution, including Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell had had a state funeral at Westminster Abbey. So again, just like kings, just like being a king, and his body was dug up from Westminster Abbey. He was beheaded. His body was thrown in a pit. So this was really Charles's way of saying, look, I might seem like a nice guy. I might, be trying to play nice with everybody, but don't mess with the monarchy. I want to show you the true power of the monarchy, and I'm going to get my revenge on my father. So I mentioned a minute ago that Charles had no heirs, this whole exclusion crisis with his Catholic brother. So when Charles came out of exile, he was relatively poor. And as a new king, like with all kings or heirs, he had to make a good marriage. And he made a very good marriage. He made a marriage with Catherine of Braganza. She was the daughter of John IV of Portugal. And she brought a lot of money with her. She had a dowry of 500,000 pounds. She brought along with her the Portuguese territory of Bombay. That was a Portuguese territory at that time. And the right of free trade with any of the Portuguese colonies. So she really helped fill his coffers with money and trade, if you will. But Catherine did not have a happy life with Charles or an easy life with Charles. She had several miscarriages, and ultimately she had no living heirs that she could give to Charles. But Charles himself had many, many mistresses and many, many illegitimate children. And this is his eldest, that we know of anyway, his eldest illegitimate child. So when Charles was still in exile, when he was 18 years old, still in exile, living in exile, he had a child with a woman named Lucy Walter. Her family was, they fought on the royalist side. during the English Civil War. So when things started going south, they too ran off and fled and went to Europe. Right from the start, Charles acknowledged that he was the father of this young man, a man named James, and he later created him the Duke of Monmouth, gave him a title. And he had an affair off and on with Lucy for a while, but he eventually abandoned her and he took away her son. He cruelly took James away from her. Lucy reportedly died in poverty in Paris in 1658. She was only 29 years old, and it was believed that she had gone into prostitution at this point because she was so desperately poor. While he was in exile, Charles had 3 more children by 2 different mistresses. He would go on to have, as far as we know, at least 13 illegitimate children by 7 different women. And his court really became known when he became king. His court was really notorious for amoral and licentious behavior. He was known as the Merry Monarch. Venereal disease was so common that they actually had a doctor on call, a specialist doctor on call, just to treat venereal disease itself. And in fact, one of his mistresses actually berated Charles in front of the French ambassador, which must have been rather embarrassing. She berated him saying, "You gave me syphilis. You gave me a venereal disease." So he had quite a licentious behavior and a lot of mistresses. And we're going to look at a couple of those, 3 of those mistresses. This is Barbara Palmer. She was probably the most notorious of his mistresses. He had 5 children with her. One of the children was born at Hampton Court Palace when Charles was on honeymoon at the time at the palace with Catherine of Braganza. So you can only imagine how humiliated his new bride must have been to know that his mistress was having his child at the same time. Now, Barbara insisted on becoming an official mistress, and this is something that the French called the maîtresse centrée. And what this meant was basically you are formally recognized. You are out in public with the king. You are attending events with the king, sometimes right along with the queen as well, the king and the queen. Very, very odd. You were bestowed with jewels and bestowed with fancy apartments and titles. And indeed, Charles did give Barbara titles. She was married, but he later made her the Countess of Castlemaine and then the Duchess of Cleveland. She had sumptuous, beautiful, huge, extravagant apartments in Whitehall Palace. They were said to be bigger than the Queen's apartments in Whitehall Palace. So again, this, poor Catherine is getting this thrown right in her face. Not uncommon. Charles wasn't the only one that did this. As I said, this was a popular thing in France as well. He also let Barbara get revenue from various taxes and custom duties. And this was revenue that was supposed to be used, obviously, for the treasury, for the government. And he let her use it for her own use, to buy what she wanted, to pay off her gambling debts. She was said to be very passionate, demanding, violent-tempered. She dominated Charles, they said, but they always say this about women, so who knows for sure. But we do know that she did hold some political and personal power over him at court. And she did include, she did oversee the downfall of a couple of major office holders who she clashed with. So she did have quite a bit of influence over Charles. And later he entered into a relationship with this woman, Louise de, I'm not even going to try to say her last name because it's been 50 years since I studied French and I will just butcher it. Later, he made her the Duchess of Portland. She was only 21, 22 when she took up with him. She had a son with him. And just as with Barbara, she got titles, she got jewels, she got money, and she got a fancy apartment at the palace. And in fact, they even went a little bit further with this one. There was a 2-week celebration, official celebration of his coupling with Louise as his official mistress. And they had a mock wedding marriage between them. Again, it said that she held some sway over him. She was a French Catholic, so she wasn't, again, popular with the people, especially when it came to, it was believed she influenced some French policies. We don't know that for sure, but we do know that Louise had a sweeter temper. Charles didn't tire of her as he later did Barbara. And the last one I wanted to mention, keeping an eye on time here, is Nell Gwynn. Probably some of you have heard of Nell Gwynn, very different from Charles's more aristocratic mistresses. She rose from very humble beginnings. She became an actress on stage. She went into the theater. She was about 19 years old when she became Charles's mistress. He was almost 40 years old. She really was a long-time favorite of Charles. Charles really did adore her. She had two sons by Charles, one of whom died. He did not move Nell into the royal apartments because she wasn't aristocratic. He never gave her a title, but he did give her a very grand house right near Whitehall Palace. So she was very close at hand, but she never got quite the same perks. He supported her, but not quite the same perks as her predecessors had. But he liked her easygoing manner, her personality. She had a very risque sense of humor. In fact, one time it was said that her carriage was surrounded. She was out in the streets of London and her carriage was surrounded by a crowd who mistook her for Louise, that Catholic French mistress of Charles's, because these guys overlapped too. The mistresses overlapped from time to time. So her carriage was surrounded by these angry people who thought it was Louise. And Nell was supposedly said, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." Now, as I said, he had two sons with Nell. The surviving son, he did make the Earl of Burford, even though he didn't give Nell a title. But supposedly this happened because one time he was visiting Nell and the young son was there, and Nell yelled to her son, "Come here, you little bastard, and say hello to your father." And Charles protested and said, "You can't talk like that. That's a terrible thing to say." And she said, "Well, your majesty has given me no other name by which to call him. In other words, you didn't give him a title like you gave your other offspring." So indeed, he gave his son the title. And on his deathbed, it was said that Charles II told his brother, the future James II, let not poor Nellie starve. He was worried about Nell Gwyn and her future. Now, his social life and extramarital affairs did interfere with his judgment from time to time. It was said that he broke off talks on war and peace with a French delegation because he didn't want to keep Barbara Palmer, waiting for dinner. And we know in 1667, he was engaged with the Dutch in a war over trading rights. He ran out of money. He asked Parliament for 1.5 million pounds. And they said, we're not going to give it to you because we gave you 5 million pounds for this war and you can't account for half of it. Where is it? They suspected he was giving it to his mistresses. So he said, "Okay, well, I can't do anything about this." He parked his ships. He had the naval park in this river area in southeast England. The Dutch found out about it. They came, they captured ships, they burned ships. And supposedly, while all of this was going on, which should have been really disastrous for Charles, he was hanging out with Barbara. He was not paying attention. So he was much more consumed with his personal life in some ways than his professional life. But there were things that held him in good stead. There were a couple of incidences in particular where he did show good leadership. The first was in 1665, the Great Plague of 1665 hit Britain, hit Europe. It was a very bad plague. London was very badly hit. Up to 100,000 individuals, or 15% of the population, died in the plague. People were fleeing and dying. And so, of course, the economic life came to a halt, just like during COVID here. Everything shut down. People were off the streets. The economy was bad. Charles and his court did remain in London during the early months of the epidemic, and he worked with public health officials very closely to kind of oversee what they were doing to address this, and he was seen as a stabilizing presence. And then the second incident was only a year later, the Great Fire of 1666. This was really devastating. It started on September 2nd, 1666 in a bakery near Pudding Lane. And there are a lot of factors that made this a really bad fire. It was a very dry summer leading up to the fire. There were high winds, gale force winds coming off the Thames at the time the fire started. There were warehouses in the area that were packed with combustible goods. And the Lord Mayor didn't take early leadership of getting the fire under control as he should have. So you had this out of control disaster. The fire lasted for almost 5 days. 4/5 of the city was destroyed. 100,000 people were left homeless. More than 13,000 houses were lost. And 89 of the original 109 churches in the city, including St. Paul's Cathedral, were totally destroyed. You had public order breaking down, you had looting, you had violence, but Charles stayed Charles was on horseback, more or less in the front lines, if you will, along with his brother, the future James II, and both of them kind of oversaw operations from the front lines. And again, that made him somewhat popular. Now, I said that, his court was often seen as licentious and scandalous and dissolute, but Charles really did care about the arts and sciences, and they thrived in his reign. He, after the Puritans had shut down all the theaters, when Charles came to the throne, he issued an exclusive rights to build 2 new playhouses, to create new theatrical companies in London, and for the first time, he had women appearing on stage. But he also had a really strong interest in science. So in 1662, he granted a charter to the science-based Royal Society, which still exists to this day, and he founded the Royal Observatory out in Greenwich. So this really aligned with his personal interests in science and chemistry, mathematics. And another legacy from Charles II's reign, which still survives today, is the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. In 1681, responding to the need to look after poor, old, injured soldiers, Charles issued a royal warrant, and he said, okay, we're going to build a home for these military pensioners who have nowhere to go. And it was designed by Christopher Wren, who did St. Paul's Cathedral after the Great Fire. And there's a statue in the courtyard of Charles and looking like a Roman emperor. And also a painting in the Great Hall where the pensioners have their meals. And you can see here the sort of allegory of the great Charles here. Today, there are about 300 Army veterans who live at the Royal Hospital. Any former soldier of the British Army over the age of 65 who is spending their advanced years alone can apply for residency. You can often see them. This is in Chelsea, and I stay in Chelsea when I'm in London. Every once in a while, you'll see one of them out on the street walking around, and they're always wearing those beautiful red coats. And you can go in and take a sort of a self-guided tour of parts of the Royal Chelsea Hospital, but that was quite a legacy that he left. So Charles died on February 6th, 1685. It was reported he had converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, but that's contestable. There's no verifiable evidence of this, although some people swear he did. Now, he had this charismatic personality that helped ensure his survival on the throne. He was a political pragmatist. Unlike his father, who was stubborn, Charles was flexible, he was savvy, and when he had to be, he was ruthless, as we saw. He was very, very savvy. And he was succeeded, as we shall see next month, by his brother, James II, the Catholic king. Okay, so what I want to close out with is just talking a little bit about Charles III, very briefly, in terms of, so how do we compare these 3 kings? Well, today, the 3rd King Charles, it's a constitutional monarchy, right? He's a constitutional monarch, so he has no real power. He doesn't need to concern himself with funding wars or levying taxes. That's all taken care of by Parliament. But he does share some of the attributes of his royal namesakes. He is a man of very strong principles, like Charles I. He is very spiritual, like Charles I. And he's a patron of artists, as was Charles I. Like Charles II, he displays religious tolerance. He connects well with people. He has a more common touch, if you will. Although after the coronations, some people were complaining the coronation cost so much they didn't think he had quite the common touch, but nonetheless, he was always liked as Prince of Wales pretty much and had a common touch. And he loves theater. He supports theater. He sponsors theater. So he's like both of those kings in many ways. Now, he is pragmatic and flexible, but he can also be uncompromising. He reportedly told his mother, the late Queen, that his mistress, Camilla Parker Bowles, who is now, of course, Queen Camilla, was a non-negotiable part of his life. He was not giving her up. After the death of Diana, when he wanted to marry her, it took him many, many years before they did marry, but he said, nope, not giving her up. So he does have some of the attributes of his predecessors. And that's where we're going to end that. I will say that, let me just, excuse me, stop sharing my screen and turn on my video. So the next talk will be on Wednesday, July 19th at 2:00. And that will be on the other stewards, the rest of the stewards. James II, who will have a lot to talk about, and his two daughters who succeeded him. So, any questions, comments? You can unmute.
That was
yourself.
fabulous, Deb.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's again, like with everything, you have to leave a lot out. Couldn't really talk about the English Civil Wars, couldn't get into all of the pieces I would have liked to, but I did want to kind of show, I hope I showed a thread connection between the three of them in terms of how there were some similarities and differences. And I always found it fascinating that Charles I and II were such different beasts. And even though Charles II had a lot of the same problems and did a lot, did a lot of things that people raise their eyebrows at, he managed to stay on at least pretty much on the good side of Parliament through being politically savvy, unlike his father.
So, Deb, I have a really very specific question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot because it's maybe you can't answer it. But you said that the second, during his reign, women started to appear on the stage, and but one of his mistresses was Nell Gwynn, who was an actress. So, which came first? There were women on the stage and Nell Gwynn was one of them?
He was already, I believe she was already on the stage when he went. Yeah, he loved theater. He almost as soon as he came, yeah, she was definitely on the stage before she was his mistress, because almost as soon as he came to the throne in 1660, he created those new theaters. He had new playhouses, and they started allowing women to be on the stage. Okay. And he loved going to the theater, so that's
okay.
Yeah,
so that happened first, and then he spotted Nell Gwynn.
And he spotted Nell Gwynn,
as opposed to her being an influence for that to happen.
No. She was not an influence for that to happen, not at all. And it's kind of interesting because just as an aside, the place I always stay in Chelsea is this huge apartment building, ginormous apartment building, but it's called Nell Gwynn House. Why? I don't know why it was called Nell Gwynn House. I should look at the history of it, but there's a statue of her over the door. Yeah.
Well, it was really interesting, as always. You are a treasure.
Oh, I don't know about that, but thank you.
Well, no. I mean, for love living at home, it's just great.
I always feel smarter. Connected to this, as I mentioned, I was just asked by Lifelong to do a 2-hour talk on Charles III, a little bit of his background, his biography, although I don't know, it seems like people have probably heard all of this because of the recent coronation, but they wanted me to talk about him and his upbringing, and also talk about the recent coronation, what was different, what was similar, what was different. So if anyone's interested, I can always knock that down to an hour if you're not getting tired of hearing me talk. But we've got other ones first, but I thought I would mention that one too. Other comments or questions? I would encourage you, if you get to London again and you haven't already done so, to go over to Chelsea and visit the Royal Chelsea Hospital. It really is a very interesting place. You can go into the dining hall, the Great Hall where the pensioners eat. You can go into there's a beautiful chapel that was created by Christopher Wren, and walk around the grounds. And if you've heard of the Chelsea Flower Show, they're on the grounds of the Royal Chelsea Hospital. But it's a fascinating place. And they've got a little museum. You can see different things from the museum. So it's an interesting place to visit. And you can also go to Banqueting House in central London. And there's just one large room you see in Banqueting House, but that's kind of interesting as well. Other. Okay, well, thanks to everybody for coming yet again.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And hopefully I will see some of you in July as we close out the Stuarts and finish off with the Stuarts and see what happens to that pesky James II and his Catholic reign, which again, it's always religious strife. We don't get rid of that until we get to the Georgians, which is in August, but yeah, or July. But anyway, have a good rest of your day. and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.